Cubase's excellent MIDI sequencing facilities make it a great platform for anybody interested in orchestral scoring. Now that might be for adding orchestral sounds to a conventional song project, it might be if you're interested in writing music to picture, or it may simply be that you want to learn the skills of orchestral writing and orchestral arrangement. Fortunately, every version of Cubase, whether it's Elements, Artist or Pro, does provide you with access to Steinberg's Iconica Sketch library. It's free, it's available to use within Sonic, and it packs a broad palette of orchestral sounds into a very compact format. Now, this isn't intended to be a video on the basics of orchestral scoring. That would be a very long video. Indeed, I suspect it would be multiple long videos in the form of a complete course. However, we can look at the first step of that process, the most important first step that you need to undertake, and that's to get Iconica Sketch set up within a suitable Cubase project so you can begin to explore the scoring process. That's something we can deal with here in a relatively short video format, so let's get started. If you haven't already done it, you do need to obviously start by installing the Iconica Sketch library. If you open the Steinberg download assistant and go to your current version of Cubase, in this case for me it's Cubase Pro 15, if you then go into Virtual Instruments and Libraries category, you will see Iconica Sketch is listed as one of the entries that's available to you. This would be true if you were using Elements and Artist as well. And you would simply then choose to download and install from the download assistant prompts. I've now opened an empty Cubase project. Now just note here I'm working within Cubase Elements, and all I've done is added a single virtual instrument track, an instance of Sonic. I open Sonics, I can then browse to find the Iconica Sketch library, and from the browser I can now see the various instruments that that library has to offer. So it's a broad collection of individual instruments across all of the major sections of the orchestra, and in addition, all of the key instruments include a selection of performance articulations. So let's illustrate that in a simple way. Let's open the cello. I can trigger notes on my MIDI keyboard. What you can see along the middle of the screen is the different performance articulations that you have available for this cello sound. So we've got the staccato, pizzicato, spiccato, a sustained sound, a legato if you want to run notes together, tremolo sound, and sustained with vibrato. The shorter sounds, the non-sustained sounds, it's MIDI velocity that controls the dynamics. Whereas with the sustained sounds, sustained, legato, tremolo, sustained, vibrato, you use the mod wheel to control the performance dynamics. I've simply used my mouse to switch between these different articulations, but you can see each of these articulations is associated with a key switch. These are the yellow keys that are in the MIDI keyboard graphic here. And what that means is that you can switch between these different articulations using MIDI notes that lie outside the range in which the instrument itself actually can be played. So for example, the last MIDI note that you can use for the cello is C1 on your MIDI keyboard, but the key switches start at C0. And the same process applies for all of the other instruments that offer performance articulations. And if you then record a MIDI performance for an instrument, you can either add the key switches as you record, or you can edit those key switches in after you've done the recording process. Either way, those key switches are then part of the MIDI clip that you create, and every time you play back that MIDI clip, those key switches will also be executed along with the notes of the actual performance. So all you need to do then is load up the various instruments you need into your Cubase project, create some ensemble performances, add a touch of reverb, and this then becomes a very effective palette of sounds to learn about and experiment with orchestral composition. Now, in principle, that sounds very straightforward, and even in practice, actually, it is. But to be able to use that full orchestral sound requires a lot of these individual instruments, if not all of them, to be available to you. And configuring that is not something you want to do from scratch in every project. So the time spent on creating a suitable project structure and then creating a Cubase project template from that structure means that you build it one time and then can use it many times. And in the end, that saves a considerable amount of time in the long run, meaning that when you want to start a new orchestral composition, you simply create a project from that template and it comes pre-configured with all of the instruments already loaded. So what makes the basis then for a good structure? Well, the answer here may depend a little bit on which version of Cubase you're using, Elements or Artist and Pro. In Artist and Pro, you have unlimited virtual instrument tracks. The limit is only controlled by your computer's performance resources, CPU, hard drive, and so on. So you could use an individual VSTI track with an instance of Halion Sonic on it for each of the instruments within the Iconica Sketch library. However, within Elements, you are limited to 24 VST instrument tracks, alongside 48 audio tracks and 64 MIDI tracks. So that same approach that you could use within Artist and Pro won't work within Elements. You'd just run out of VSTI tracks before you'd loaded the full Iconica Sketch sound palette. That would be limiting, but it also might be problematic if you actually want to layer your orchestral sounds with some other sorts of sounds, some synth sounds, for example, to create a sort of hybrid score. However, there's a very simple approach that can work around this for Elements users, and to keep things inclusive, that's what I'm going to adopt here. It's also perfectly suitable for Artist and Pro users, could use the principles here and adapt them if they wish to, given their unlimited VSTI instrument track counts in their versions of the software. So let's get into that approach that works in Elements, Artist and Pro, and we'll start with the string section. Starting with a completely empty project, let's open the Add Track dialog. I'm going to pick an instance of Halion Sonic. I'm going to give this a suitable name, add the track. Now, as you may be aware, Halion Sonic is multi-timbral. What that means is that you can load multiple instrument sounds into up to 16 slots. Each of those slots responds to a different MIDI channel, by default running from MIDI channel 1 to MIDI channel 16. So what I'm going to do here is load each of my 5 individual string sounds into the first 5 of the slots within Halion Sonic. I'm going to start with the first violins. I'm then going to add the second violins. I'm then going to add the violas, the cello, and the basses. So this single instance of Halion Sonic now has all 5 of my main string subsections within it. Each of these will respond to a different MIDI channel. So if I now go back to the Add Track dialog and add some MIDI tracks and choose to add 5 of those 5 MIDI tracks by default be configured to MIDI channel 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. If I use the first of those, I can trigger the first violins. The second of those, I can trigger the second violins. Third of those, I will trigger the violas, cello, and the basses. So what this means is, on a single virtual instrument track, but with my 5 MIDI tracks, I can control these 5 different elements of the string section. So I've now tidied up the display of that a little bit and given it a little bit more structure. So my Iconica Sketch string section is all contained on a single virtual instrument track. It's being driven by MIDI data on these 5 individual MIDI tracks. They're all color-coded, labeled, and contained within a single folder track within my project window. Now, because we have all 5 of the string subsections within a single instance of Halion Sonic, if you do want to do any mixing between these different instruments, their relative levels, for example, you need to do that within Halion Sonic as well. And you need to go to the Halion Sonic mix page, where you can adjust the relative levels of each of these 5 instruments. However, you can also adjust their pan position. And of course, you can make those adjustments entirely to taste. But if you want to follow conventions, particularly in terms of orchestral panning, There are all sorts of useful sources you can go and look at, including an article you can go and look at from Sound On magazine by Philip Meehan. And if you scroll down, one of the interesting things you'll find is a nice diagram that summarizes how you ought to pan your virtual orchestral instruments if you want them to reflect how they would be placed on a stage in a real orchestra. I said this wasn't a video about the basics of orchestration, but if you do want a quick guide in terms of setting some panning positions up, there's a good starting point that you could use. And if you do want to get started with orchestration, there are some additional articles you could undoubtedly find in the SOS archive. So having configured my string section, I will now simply apply exactly the same principles to the other orchestral sections to round out my full orchestral palette within this project. So I've now followed exactly the same principles and created similar setups for the brass section with a single instance of Hallian Sonic, populated by multiple brass instruments from the Iconica Sketch library, and each of these instruments now has an associated MIDI track. Same thing with the woodwind section, single instance of Hallian Sonic, multiple instruments loaded into that instance, and each of those woodwind instruments is now associated with its own MIDI track again. Same within the percussion section, single instance of Hallian Sonic, multiple individual instruments from the Iconica Sketch library, each with their own MIDI track, and then a final group with a couple of the additional instruments, again, loaded into a single instance of Hallian Sonic. In addition, within the project, I've created group channels, each of those orchestral sections. I've also added a single reverb effect into my project, and if we flip to the mix console, we can see all of the individual instrument and MIDI tracks displayed. Located at the right end of the mix console, there are my various group channels, my reverb. I've also created a master bus, so all of these group channels and the reverb are going off to the master bus and then onto a stereo out. So I can apply reverb to each of my main instrument sections of the orchestra using an instance of Roomworks here that's available in Cubase Elements. And to complete the setup on my master bus, I've got a simple instance of the compressor just to catch any stray peaks. So even though Cubase Elements only supports a maximum of 24 virtual instrument tracks, what we have here using just 5 virtual instrument tracks, all 34 instruments that Iconica Sketch has to offer, loaded and ready to go in a single Cubase project, even within Cubase Elements. So we now have a project fully configured in terms of the Iconica Sketch instrument selection, ready to start composing with. And if we want to instantly recall this project format every time we want to do a composition with Iconica Sketch, what we need to do is create a project template. So to the File menu, Save as Template, pick a suitable name, hit OK. Now if I close this project and wanted to start a new project using that template, from the hub, I simply scroll to find the template I've just created, create a new project from that template, pick a folder, instantly, the project appears a full orchestral setup ready for us to start a new composition. And now all we have to do is learn the not inconsiderable skill of composing for an orchestra. Now within this Steinberg download assistant, there is a demo project for Iconica Sketch. That's designed to work with the Artist and Pro versions of the software. I've adapted that project very slightly to make it compatible in this template that we've just created for Cubase Elements. So by way of just giving a brief demonstration of what this template allows us to do, let's just listen to this short demo by way of closing out the video. Iconica Sketch makes a great introduction for any Cubase user interested in exploring orchestral composition. However, the workflow involved when using Iconica Sketch is much more straightforward if you start with a pre-configured project. Hopefully, this video has given you some ideas of how you might go about that process. And if it might help, there is a Cubase project that you can download from my website. There's a link in the video description below. If you're interested in this kind of Cubase related content, please do subscribe to the channel, and you can check out the other links in the video description below for some further Cubase content. Thanks very much for watching, and until next time, I hope you enjoy getting some music made.